Hello, welcome to our webinar today. We're Contact, the charity for families with disabled children and children with additional needs of any kind, with and without diagnosis, and from the ages of 0 to 25. We hope you enjoy the webinar today and find it informative. If you need any support afterwards, please do not hesitate to get in touch with us.
Thank you very much indeed, Kate. Very kind introduction. Lovely to see everyone again. I was online yesterday, so I've seen a couple of names in the chat who were also attending yesterday. So lovely to see you back. Glad I didn't scare you away. Now then, let me just share my screen. Hopefully that should be coming up all right, and you should be able to see a title screen that says Decisions, Decisions. Kate, if you wouldn't mind just giving me a thumbs up if that's there. I'm hoping it is. You seem to have frozen. I hope that's not just, it's not just lovely, good, excellent. Thank you very much indeed. So welcome everyone. It's really nice to see you. Thank you so much for joining on. So today, yes, I'm going to be talking really about decisions, how we can take decisions for children, how we can take decisions for adults, whether or not they lack mental capacity. First, a little bit about me. There is an awful picture of me, but it's the one I'm stuck with from our marketing department. So there it is. I am a solicitor with Irwin Mitchell, and I'm from the private client team. As such, I specialise in mental capacity law, powers of attorney, deputyships, all that side of it. And I really, my focus is very much providing peace of mind for families with vulnerable individuals. And that can be ranging from making powers of attorney, applying for deputyship, putting in place wills and trusts and so forth. Just really making sure there are the legal tools available for when either you're not around or when you want to take decisions for your children. Irwin Mitchell itself is pretty big. We've got departments that deal with pretty much everything. So whatever issue you've got, do feel free to drop us a line. Very, very happy to help out. But as I say, today I'm focusing on mental capacity. A brief agenda for the day, and as Kate said, I'm very happy to take questions as we go through in the chat. There are no stupid questions, as I said yesterday. If you're thinking or wanting to ask something, I guarantee someone else on the call will also be wanting to ask the same question or be facing very similar issues. So ask away, please do. So what I'm going to look at is really what is mental capacity. We'll then talk about your role as a parent, what you can, what you can't do, what the law, or how the law views you really. We're going to be talking about authority, so how you can be given the ability to take decisions for other people. Focusing in then on lasting powers of attorney and deputyship. I'll explain the difference between the two. There's a lot of misunderstanding out there because it's a complicated area. And I'll then be talking about how you can act as a deputy or attorney, and then have a brief word on will trusts. If you were around yesterday, I spoke on that in great detail, and would encourage you, if you can access the recording, to have a look at it, because it ties in reasonably with questions about mental capacity as well. I'm going to ask the question, what is mental capacity? And I confess I actually Googled all these various quotes because I thought it'd be interesting to see how the internet, how the world views mental capacity. And I was really interested with the words that were coming out. Very much it's talking about ability, being able to take decisions. It's about you, very much, can the individual take the decision? Does the individual themselves have the ability to do it? And then it's about being informed, understanding. So mental capacity very much, can you understand what you need to take your decision yourself? And I really want to underline that your bit. The Mental Capacity Act came in 2005, and it really puts vulnerable individuals lacking mental capacity right at the center of everything. Rather than the old days, 1985 was the old Mental Health Act, and that was a little bit more dismissive in its way. It very much said capacity is black or white. You've either got it or you haven't. But the mental capacity that's actually evolved, and it's really good to see it happen, because the law defines capacity as being time and decision specific. What do I mean by that? Fortunately, the law nowadays recognises the capacity is not black and white. It's either not that you blanket got it or you blanket haven't. It's very much, what's the decision being taken? Are you deciding to have lunch? At that time, can you decide to have lunch? Have you got the ability to do that? If not, maybe at that point in time you lack capacity. Later on in the day, you may have the ability to understand that, oh, I'm hungry. Yes, I'm going to go off and have tea or whatever it might be. So it's very much a question about looking at that moment in time, the snapshot in time. Do you have the ability to take the decision in question? And then we move on to, what is capacity? How do you decide if someone's got capacity or not? And the starting point is this wonderful language from the statute. Does the donor have an impairment or disturbance of the functioning of the mind or brain? I absolutely love that language just because it sounds so grand, really. But what it's saying is there something physical wrong with the brain? Is there something kind of broken in there? Are the pathways and the neurons not connecting or not firing properly, which you might see with a brain injury or with dementia or something like that? Or is it the way the mind is working? Something's going wrong in the thought process, which might be a learning difficulty or something like that. Now, yes, a learning difficulty might have an underlying physical condition, but it's all about, is that decision-making ability working properly, either due to something physical or due to something psychological in many ways. And it can be something temporary, as I say. It could be that, you've been out on a Friday night and had way too much to drink, and you haven't got capacity there to decide to make a will or, drive a car or anything like that. So capacity can be lost temporarily. So if you tick that box and say, yes, someone does have an impairment or a disturbance in the function of the mind and brain, then you ask these 4 questions. Can the individual, and in this case, I'm talking about donor of a power of attorney, but can the individual generally understand the information they need to take the decision? So have they got the ability to really grasp what the facts are? Secondly, can they retain the information long enough to form a decision? And this is what I quite often see with clients who are living with dementia. That short-term memory is gone. We can start the conversation and they get it, they get the facts. 20 minutes later, they've forgotten what it is. Is that a long enough period to form a decision? Now, for simple decisions, that might be fine. I'm hungry. Oh yeah, I'll go to the kitchen and make some lunch. For decisions that have much more long-term impact, like should a house be sold, probably not. Then you've got to ask the question whether they can weigh the information. Can they understand the risk of what the decision is, the pros and cons? And that's where a lot of people who might have learning difficulties or ADHD or something like that really struggle. They fail to see the outcomes. And I dealt with a lovely lady ages ago who struggled a bit with the concept of money. And she loved gambling, loved going to the dogs, and she could understand that if she went to the dogs and spent 20 quid on gambling that night, she wouldn't have enough for dinner. Fine, she can weigh that risk. She understood it, and that's fine. She had capacity to take the decision. She could gamble away £20 that night. Problem is, when it got to larger sums of money, it's very interesting. She didn't have the ability to understand the impact of the decision. So if she took £100,000 and gambled away on the dogs, she couldn't grasp the fact that she might need to get a mortgage, she might have to sell her house or lose all her savings. So the capacity was really interesting in that case, that for small decisions, okay, for large decisions, it was gone. And then the final question is, can they communicate their decision with or without assistance? So it might be using a light writer, sign language, an interpreter or a speech and language therapist, something like that. And if the answer to any of those questions is no, then they lack capacity. But it really is going through that test, and everything possible needs to be done to help the person reach a decision, to communicate their decision and weigh everything up and remember long enough. You know, it might be using diagrams, it might be using models or things. And we've got a very good capacity assessor who I go to quite a lot for, particularly for wills, assessing whether people have the capacity to make wills. And he's got a great analogy of a chap who loved chocolate bars. He had a big, you know, tub of roses or whatever it is on the center of the table, and he's got all the little ones, and, you know, Mars bars and Twixes and all sorts of things in there. And he was trying to get him to understand how to divide his estate between his various family members. And he took this box of chocolates and said, well, you know, if we count this little purple one that no one likes, you know, who's that for? Oh, that's for the sister. What about this big yummy Mars bar? Oh yeah, that's for mum. I like her more. And he divided up his estate using the chocolates as an analogy. So while he couldn't necessarily understand the value of money per se, he did understand the size and sort of sums that might be involved with that analogy. So what if someone lacks capacity? I think the first misconception is family doesn't necessarily have an automatic right to take decisions, particularly not for adults. And I often come across cases where people say, well, we're married, surely I can decide whether my spouse should have an operation, or surely I can access their bank account. No, there needs to be specific authority there for you to be able to take those decisions. It's a little bit different with children and parents. I'm going to come on to that in a second. If someone lacks capacity and the bank's not satisfied, they have the ability to manage their finances, the bank can freeze the account. Investments can be put on hold. A house can't be sold unless the individual understands what they're doing when they sign the transfer deed. Child trust funds, these are a real, I've got a slight bugbear about them, I must admit. Lots of people were encouraged to do them. Yes, they're a great tax-free saving for children, encouraging people to build up saving pots for children, which is fantastic. But no thought was given by the government at the time of what if you have a child who lacks capacity at the age 18? They can't access those funds because they lack the mental capacity to be able to withdraw the money. And the parent has no authority to access the funds because the child is now over 18. And in that case, if the child can't make a power of attorney, the parent has to trot off to court and get a deputyship, which is a long-winded and can be expensive process, just to access £500, £600, £700 or maybe £1,000 in a child trust fund. So I say it's a bit of a bugbear of mine that no thought really was given to how child trust funds should be managed for individuals who might lack capacity at age 18. If you lack capacity, you might not be able to make or change a will, which can cause all sorts of problems. The court can step in and change someone's will, but only if there's overriding evidence that it's the right thing to do. When it comes to taking medical and care decisions, as I say, even if you're married, it's actually the doctors who will take the medical decisions, or the treating nurse. Basically, the treating medical practitioner will say, right, it will come to the conclusion that this person lacks capacity. Should an operation go ahead? Yes, they'll consult with the family, but ultimately the decision is taken by the doctor. And similarly with social services, should this person move into a care home, we'll consult with the family. We've concluded they lack capacity. We, social services, take the decision. So how do parents fit into this? Well, basically, if your child is under 18, you have control of their finances. Basically, until age 18, a child actually can't give what's called give good receipt for money. They can't actually own assets. Now, they might have a bank account in their name, but really what it is it's kind of a sort of a nominee arrangement. You are actually the controller of that account as the parent, as the legal guardian. Whereas the child can't actually necessarily go into the bank and say, oh, give me all my money, please. I'm going to invest it overseas or whatever it might be. As soon as they reach age 18, you have no authority over their finances, even if they lack capacity. And I'll talk about what we can do about that in a bit. Health decisions are more complicated. And we've got a specialist team, our public law team, who specialise very, very much in this area. My focus tends to be the financial decisions, and they focus very much on the health side. But just to give you a sort of brief overview. Effectively, if a child is under the age of 16, the question is, can they understand? Do they have the competence to understand the particular medical procedure that's required? And if they do, they can actually consent to that treatment, even if the parent refuses. If the child understands and the doctors are satisfied they understand, or in some cases the court might need to step in and determine whether they've got competence, then they can say, yeah, I want to go ahead with that treatment. But we've also got to look at about refusal. So yes, the child can consent to treatment, but ironically, even if a child is competent to refuse treatment, the parent can still consent on their behalf whilst they're under the age of 16. So you get a slightly sort of conflicting situation here. Yes, the child can consent, but they might not necessarily be able to refuse. Between 16 to 18, the child again can consent to treatment, and that can't be overridden by the parent. If they understand, if they've got mental capacity, they can consent to the specific treatment, can't be overridden by a parent. And the parent generally can consent to treatment if a child lacks capacity over the age of 16. So it's a bit of a legal grey area between 16 and 18. But generally speaking, you still have some authority to take decisions for children. Over 18, same as the financial situation. You have no right to consent or refuse treatment on behalf of your child, regardless of their mental capacity. That's when the decision-making falls into the hands of the local authorities in respective care, or the doctors treating medical professionals, respective medical treatment. So how can you be given authority? How can you get the ability to take these decisions? And I'm looking at this rather in the context of being able to take decisions for your children, but you should also look at it in context of yourselves. As we get older, the risks of dementia, stroke, and all these sorts of things increase. So it's important to make sure you put in place your own arrangements to make sure that your partner, your spouse, your family members can take decisions for you. And there's all sorts of ways you can do this. There's a general powers of attorney, lasting powers, enduring powers, healthcare proxy, advanced care statement, do not resuscitate, or advanced decision to refuse treatment. I mean, there's hundreds of things out there to try and authorize people to take decisions. But all of those things I've listed there, they all require the person making that legal document to have the ability to do so. Jumping back to that mental capacity test, can they understand, retain, weigh, communicate in order to say, yes, I want to make a lasting power of attorney or an enduring power of attorney? I'll just briefly run through those things, as I say, just to help understand terms, but I will be focusing very much on the lasting power of attorney during the course of this. But a general power of attorney is a very simple document where you literally say to someone, I'm happy for you to do this task on my behalf. It might be, if you're going abroad, you can leave someone to deal with your house sale. But a general power of attorney does not survive you losing capacity. So if you sign a general power of attorney and then lose capacity, the general power of attorney stops dead, can't be used anymore. A lasting power of attorney continues. This is the idea. This is really the future planning, the idea that you're setting someone up to take decisions generally in relation to your health or your finances in the event you lose capacity. Enduring powers of attorney, you can't make any new enduring powers of attorney ever since 2007, but they're sort of the old style lasting power of attorney. If you made one before 2007 and it was valid, it's still valid. It can still be used to take decisions, but you just can't make any new ones. Healthcare proxies, that's really just a statement saying, I'm happy for this person to be consulted. I'm happy for this person to take decisions on my behalf. But if you lose capacity, that healthcare proxy loses the ability to take decisions for you. They should still be consulted, but they can't take the decision. And an advanced care statement really is you setting out, this is what I'd like to happen. If I lose capacity, I'd like to live at home, or I'd like to move into a care home that accepts pets, or I'd like to be with my spouse, or whatever it might be. Just a general guidance to whoever's involved in your treatment, be that an attorney, a doctor, a nurse, a care home manager. They understand what's important to you. And I would advise anyone does that really, and really dive into detail. Think about what hobbies you like, what television programs like, what music, what food. And I think it's really important, because even if you lack capacity, it doesn't mean you don't lose emotions. You can still be happy, sad, frustrated, angry. And if someone's trying to feed you curry and you hate curry every day, then yes, you're going to be angry. Yes, you're going to be upset. So the more information you give to people involved in your care in advance, the better your life will be. There's a do not resuscitate order. I don't really like that term order. It's not actually an order. Basically, it's a document that's made in conjunction with medical professionals where you say you effectively refuse treatment to prolong your life. It is though guidance to the paramedics, to the doctors, whoever it might be. It's not necessarily binding, unlike an advanced decision to refuse treatment, also known as a living will. In that, you basically say, if this situation arises, for example, if I'm unconscious and unlikely to regain consciousness, you must switch off a life support machine. And that is binding. If you make it during time when you have capacity, you understand the risks, it's signed, it's witnessed, then that is binding on anyone involved in your treatment in the future. So it's a very, very powerful document, and not one to be entered into lightly. Now, I do have clients say, well, I've got specific religious beliefs or whatever it might be, and I will always want to refuse, for example, a blood transfusion or something like that. An advanced decision to refuse treatment there would be very, very relevant. I'm going to say for longer term things where there might be advances in medical science that could save your life and give you a quality of life, it might be worth thinking, is the advanced decision the right thing? Maybe a better thing to do is leave that decision in the hands of health attorneys, which I'll come on to in a sec. But to say all of those things, you need capacity to be able to make them. If you lack capacity, then really there's only a couple of routes forward. You can have a benefits appointee. Now they can claim benefits on your behalf from the DWP and use those, but they can't manage your bank account. They can't decide to sell a house for you. They can't liaise with your pension company or sign a lease or anything like that. A deputy is required to take those decisions. And a deputy is a sort of court-appointed attorney, and I'll talk more about it. A deputy can also be appointed to take health and welfare decisions, but very rarely. And again, I'll talk more about that in a sec. So I'm going to dive more into powers of attorney and what they are. So there's two types. There's your financial power of attorney and your health power of attorney. You can have both documents. You can have one, you can have the other. I always recommend do both. I mean, from the financial point of view, if you don't have a financial power of attorney, say decisions cannot be taken for you. If you don't have a health power of attorney, decisions can be taken for you, but it would be by the treating doctor or social services. If you make the health power of attorney, it basically it sort of takes the decision making out of the hands of the doctors and social services and puts it into the hands of the person you've chosen. So there's someone you trust is taking those decisions for you. So under the financial power of attorney, it covers what you own personally, be that your house, your bank account, and so forth. It doesn't cover assets that you might benefit from, but are controlled in some other way. So I was talking yesterday about trusts. So if you're the beneficiary of a trust, the attorney can't run the trust. That's the job of the trustees. What the attorney can do is speak to the trustees and say, hang on, where's the income I was expecting to receive last month? Or please, could we have some capital to help pay some debts or something like that? So the attorneys, they can liaise with the trustees on your behalf. So they can manage a bank account, they can sell property, they can invest assets, they can pay bills, they can do all the things you could do with your money, subject to certain restrictions, which again, I'm going to come on to. So health power of attorney, very, very separate. Very, very personal. Whoever you pick as your health attorney must be someone you absolutely trust, that they understand you as an individual, and that's where that care statement really comes into force, really. So the attorney understands what your needs, your wants, and wishes are, because they can decide where you should live, who you should see, what care you should receive, and they can refuse medical treatments. They can gain access to your personal information, your medical files, and so forth. There's a big important difference between the two, though. The financial attorney, if you make it this way, can be used while you still have mental capacity. So that means, say if you want to do your round the world trip or whatever, you can leave your financial attorney in charge of your finances and everything whilst you're away. The health attorney can only be used if you lack capacity to take the specific decision in question. And the one I commonly see is, should someone move into a care home? If you have the ability to understand, weigh, retain, and communicate your decision, no one can move you into the care home against your will. It's only if you fall down on that point. And normally, where people fall down, it's that understanding the risk, not appreciating that if I stay at home, I could suffer a fall, or I could be injured, or I might not get medical treatment. Then the attorneys could step in and take the decision to move someone to a care home. When it comes to making a lasting power of attorney, there are some relatively straightforward forms on the Office of Public Guardian website. There are moves to make the process entirely digital. I must admit, I was entirely against it when I heard these plans, because I thought, it's not going to be safe. It's going to be a big risk. Anyone can hack in and plonk mum or dad in front of a computer and get them to tap out the information and make the power of attorney. But I was involved in the consultation with the Office of Public Guardian, Ministry of Justice, and actually the checks and safeguards they're putting in really look quite good. So I'm looking forward to these digital powers of attorney coming into effect. I think they will be a move in the right direction. How they'll work in practice, we'll see. But in order to make a power of attorney, the attorney needs to be able to understand the implications of making a lasting power of attorney. They need to understand that I am giving the ability to someone else to take decisions for me. They need to be able to understand that they can terminate the power of attorney at any point. So they need to be able to retain the required information long enough to form a decision about making the power of attorney, and they need to weigh all the risks. Is this the right person? Oh, I've had arguments with them before about how I would spend money compared to how they would spend money. Are they the right person to do it? Are they thinking through, will this person have the time to act as my attorney? I often have parents appointing children who are the sandwich generation. They're trying to raise young children and look after their elderly parents. Do they have the time to run someone's finances as well? It's a full-time job, really. But as I say, the key thing is the donor must be able to have capacity to make a power of attorney. Once you've made it, once you've signed the document, there's a fairly involved signing process, but once everyone's signed, you can register it or register them with the Office of Public Guardian. You don't need to register your powers of attorney straight away, but I highly recommend you do, because it takes 2 or 3 months for the Office of the Public Guardian to actually process them, register them, and send them back. And if you've made a power of attorney a few years ago and suddenly you've lost capacity, the decisions need to be taken, and then you have to register them, and it takes a 2 or 3 month period, time's up. The attorneys are not going to be able to take decisions unless the powers of attorney have been registered. So say, really recommend register it straight away once it's been made. And as I said before, financial powers of attorney can be used as soon as they've been registered, regardless of capacity, unless you restrict it in the document. You can in the document say, no, it can't be used unless a doctor confirms I lack capacity. But the health one can only be used if you lack capacity for that specific decision. The OPG, Office of Public Guardian, which is sort of like the attorney police in some ways, they charge a registration fee of £92 per lasting power of attorney. It's just gone up from 84 back in November. And their job is to receive the documents. They won't check dates of birth. They won't check addresses. They won't check specifics that you've put in there. But what they will do is check additional guidance or restrictions or things like that you've put in the power of attorney, and they will take them out. They'll apply to the court to strike out terms that they think are invalid. A classic example is where a donor tries to give authority to an attorney to make gifts and so forth under the power of attorney. There's actually a statutory restriction on attorneys making gifts, and that can't be overridden in the power of attorney itself, or requiring attorneys to get consent from another third party before they act. Again, that's an invalid term. So it's really important to check whatever conditions and things like that you put in the power of attorney are valid. Take advice on that if you have something specific in mind. As I say, people can do the powers of attorney online, and it's better to have one than not, frankly. But it's always worth taking legal advice, because I see so many problems arise from people who've made a sort of a basic power of attorney, if I can call it that, without thinking through the practical implications down the line, not understanding what attorneys can and can't do. So always worth chatting through and taking advice on it. I said I'd talk about deputyship. What is it? Broadly speaking, where someone lacks capacity to make a health or financial power of attorney, or to authorise someone else to act on their behalf, someone needs to be appointed to manage their affairs, and that's where the court comes in. Basically, it's an application to the Court of Protection, in which whoever is applying to be deputy must prove that you lack capacity. Now, I talked about capacity being decision specific, and the court can authorise a deputy or an individual to take a specific decision. Or they can make it much wider, and this is very often the case in financial deputyships. You get a medical report that says, well, yeah, this person actually really can't manage their day-to-day finances. They're going to have a problem with capacity on an ongoing basis. And if that's the case, the court can appoint a financial deputy to take financial decisions on a long-term basis. But the authority is often quite restricted compared to a power of attorney. So in a power of attorney, you can say, happy for you to deal with pretty much everything of mine, subject to the statutory restrictions. But a deputyship order from the court may say things like, you can manage the bank accounts, but you can't sell the house. And if that's the case, and you are a deputy and you want to sell the individual's house, you've got to go back to the court for another hearing to say, please, can I sell their house? So say it is much more restricted, much better idea to get a power of attorney in place in advance. It might involve a court hearing. Anyone can apply to be a deputy, and whoever is applying must notify interested parties, and they must notify at least 3 people, and usually that's family members. And you can come across some really difficult situations where there's separated spouses, and it might be very acrimonious, and one of them wants to apply to be deputy. They do need to notify the other spouse. Only in very exceptional cases will the court say we're happy for someone who should be notified not to be notified. And I mean, an example of that, I dealt with a case some years ago where we applied to the court to change the child's will because it didn't reflect their wishes. He was estranged from one of the parents, and it wouldn't have been appropriate for his estate to go to them. The reason they were estranged was due to physical abuse when the child was young. And the court said, no, because the individual will be losing out under the proposed will, you must notify them of this change that means they would lose out. We pointed out, there were protection orders in place and non-contact and all these sorts of things. What the court eventually agreed to was serving the documents, but with all the addresses and things redacted. But nonetheless, we still had to tell the individual what was happening. So say if you can keep it out of the Court of Protection, probably a good idea. So make that power of attorney if you can. Financial deputyships are granted very, very often on the basis financial decisions can't be taken unless there's a financial deputy or attorney in place. Health deputyships are very rarely granted. And the reason behind that is the court says, well, actually, there is already a system in place to take health decisions for individuals. They would be taken by the doctors in consultation with family members and carers. Why should we, the court, appoint you, one individual, above everyone else to take decisions for that individual? We thought there was some progress a few years ago, because say you have this difficulty as parents, as guardians, where when the child's over 18, if they lack capacity, it's not your decision. You've been taking all those decisions for them up until age 18. Suddenly at that point, no, it's no longer you, it's the doctor. Now, we said to the court, it seems bonkers that this should be the case. Why shouldn't a parent just carry on as a health deputy in that role? You need to have overwhelming why a health deputy should be appointed. It's more often done where perhaps it's spouses and then there's been a sudden traumatic injury or brain injury to one of the spouses. The court will generally in those cases say, yeah, actually we'll appoint the other spouse because there's going to be a ton of decisions that are going to need to be taken in a short period of time, and we haven't got time to go back and forth to the court saying we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to do the other. So it might be the case if your child has ongoing complex medical issues that require specific input from you, the court might be more swayed on a health deputyship. But as I say, the starting point generally is no, there is a procedure in place for decisions to be taken. So why is a deputy needed? Well, very similar reason for powers of attorney: to manage bank accounts, pay bills, sell property, sign contracts and leases. But a deputy is much more supervised than an attorney, and the reason being is if you're appointing an attorney, the law says, well, this is someone you trust. You feel they're going to do the right thing. We don't need to keep an eye on them day to day. Whereas a deputy is being appointed is not someone you know, and the Office of the Public Guardian want to make sure they are doing their job properly. And there's a requirement for deputies to produce accounts and report annually to the OPG saying how the money's being spent. That's not to say attorneys don't abuse their power, and I've seen that happen quite a lot. So I was going to talk about acting as an attorney and deputy. And this is where people often get unstuck. And I've got a bit of myth busting later to talk through what things I often hear from people, which occasionally make my jaw drop or have a wry smile. But the starting point for attorneys and deputies is to say, can this person take the decision themselves? And I say that's that time and decision specific test. You've got to do everything you can to help the individual reach a decision and test their capacity on each occasion. Now, that seems like a lot of work. Broadly speaking, if you're looking at managing a bank account, paying day-to-day bills, it's a pretty low bar for testing the decision. You can say, you don't necessarily need to go to them every day and say, well, I want to pay your gas bill today. Is that okay? Or I want to pay the electric bill. Is that all right? You can take a pretty casual view of it and say, well, it needs to be paid. Let's set up the standing order. But if we're looking at something much more significant, where someone should live, should the house be sold, that needs to take time. Go and see them, talk it through, obtain their views. If you think, oh, they're a bit tired today, maybe that's the reason they're not quite grasping it. Come back again tomorrow. And it is fascinating to see how people's capacity can be affected on a day-to-day basis, just from being a bit tired. I had a chap I dealt with some years ago, wanted to make a health power of attorney. I went to see him on the Wednesday, when it was Wednesday afternoon, went along to see him. And, I wasn't really getting anything in respect to the questions I was asking. Who do you would like to take decisions for you? What decision would you like to take? There was no real input. I thought, this guy's not got capacity. And his wife said, well, actually, he's just had his physiotherapy. He's had lunch. He's had physiotherapy. He's exhausted. Can you come back tomorrow morning? I was all right, fair enough. Came back next morning, bright as a button, completely got what I was talking about. So it's really important to think, is this a decision that needs to be taken now, or can we leave it and take it later? If the conclusion is they lack capacity, then any decision taken must be in the person's best interest. I'm going to underline that and really hammer that home in a sec. What attorneys and deputies can't do, they can't make gifts that are outside the statutory restrictions. And the statutory restrictions are quite narrow. Basically, as an attorney or deputy, you can only make gifts out of the individual's assets to people connected with that individual. So that might be a parent, a friend, a family member, a carer, but only if the gifts are done on customary occasions: birthdays, Christmas, anniversaries. The end of the tax year, if you want to do tax planning, is not a customary occasion to make gifts. And it must be of a reasonable amount, bearing in mind their circumstances. And really what you've got to look at there is what gifts they make previously. If they were generous and they gave 500 odd quid for a Christmas present, something like that, you can't then go out and buy a Ferrari out of their assets and go, well, they gave gifts before. It's got to be reasonable. And you've got to be thinking about, what are their needs? So, someone might have been making regular gifts, but now that they're in care, their care costs have shot up. It's no longer reasonable for them to carry on making those gifts. They need the money themselves. So you've got to proceed very, very cautiously as an attorney if you're thinking of using the individual's money for anything other than their benefit. Attorneys and deputies can't make wills for the individual. You need to get permission from the court to do that. It is possible for the court to change or make a will for someone, but there needs to be real overriding evidence, I sort of demonstrated earlier, for the will to be changed or to be made. Again, attorneys get into a bit of difficulty. taking decisions if they're conflicted. And I really encourage people to try and appoint more than one attorney, particularly an attorney who is more independent. I've come across a few cases recently where mother and son, father and son, living in the same house. Son is the attorney for the parent. Parent lacks capacity. They need to take out an equity release mortgage to pay for the care fees, whatever it might be. The son's actually conflicted because he's living in that property. He needs to take out the mortgage to help out his dad, but he can't take the decision as attorney because it impacts on his ability to stay in that house. If they had an independent third party, yeah, they could exercise their authorities as an individual attorney to sign the equity release agreement. So it's really important to say this is where it's worth taking advice when making the power of attorney. What are the situations that might come up that would affect your choice of attorneys at the outset? Attorneys can't pay themselves a wage unless it's specifically authorised in the power of attorney document itself. And they can't pay friends and family for gratuitous care unless it's been approved by the court. So if you've got a friend or family member, you think, oh, it's only right to give them something, they've given up so much of their time to look after my son, my daughter, whoever it might be. But actually, as a power of attorney, you may not be able to make payments out of the individual's own money unless the court's approved it. And getting court approval for these various things, making gifts, making wills, paying a wage, paying for gratuitous care, all these sorts of things, takes time. It can commonly be about a year-long application. And if it's opposed, it gets very expensive. If someone says, no, this isn't appropriate, it can be a very, very expensive process. So how can attorneys take decisions? Well, I've already talked about this. Can the decision be delayed? Can you wait until the person's got capacity? If not, get all the information you can. Speak to the family, speak to carers, speak to doctors, speak to the individual, find out what their views, their wishes are, look at what they did previously. Most importantly, consider the impact that the decision will have on the individual. The law says if you take decisions of an attorney or a deputy, it must be as least restrictive of their freedom as possible. And the classic example is, should this person move into a care home? Oh, well, yes, they'll be cared for there, they'll get their medication, but you're restricting their freedom. If it's possible for the person to stay at home and have carers in, that's the route you should go. And all decisions must be in their best interests. Now, unhelpfully or helpfully, depending on your view, best interest isn't defined in statute. But over the law, case laws evolved and said, it's not just saying what would they have done, what would they have liked to have done, what are their wishes. It's about adopting a real sort of balance sheet approach, looking at all the pros and cons of the situation. If I take this decision to move mum into a care home, what are the pros? She gets her medication, she's warm, she's fed, she doesn't have the outgoings on her house. Cons, she's got the outgoing in terms of care fees, she's restricted as where she can go, she's away from her family and friends, she can't have her pets. You've got those factors taken into account. Another major factor is she never wanted to move into a care home. Okay, perhaps we shouldn't take that decision. What's the practical way of keeping her at home? Never ever make assumptions. You can't assume someone lacks capacity just because of the way they dress, the way they look, or because they want to make a daft decision. And it's quite difficult with children who may be vulnerable, may be easily influenced. It might be a daft decision, but if they understand the impact of that decision and understand the risk, they've got capacity to take the decision themselves. Really recommend keeping discussions, keeping records of discussions and all the factors taken into account in case it's challenged later on, because financial decisions, health decisions, they can all be challenged by third parties. And if you are conflicted, if you are acting outside your authority as an attorney, and you haven't got approval of the Court of Protection, you can be at risk, because attorneys and deputies are personally liable, which is their duty. So if and there have been so many cases through the courts about this, you've had attorneys investing in their own businesses of terrapin farms and buying themselves Gucci handbags and things like that out of mum's money because that's what she would have wanted. Absolutely. Where's the problem? Well, the problem is you're spending this person's money without authority for your own selfish benefit. And in those cases, the attorneys were struck off. They were removed from their role by the court, and a court-appointed deputy was put in place, so an independent professional, which may be a local authority, it may be a panel solicitor, on the Court of Protection panel. and they were required to pay the money back. Where attorney abuses their power, it could be theft, and criminal proceedings can be instituted against attorneys. If it's careless, if they just didn't know the rules, and they might have made some gifts that they shouldn't have done, the court can retrospectively approve what they've done, but it shouldn't be relied upon. But if it's absolute clear financial abuse, the police will take action. Not only should you not be depleting the individual's estate as an attorney or deputy, you should be trying to preserve the value. So you should be considering tax planning. Generally, tax planning involves giving assets away, trying to reduce the value of an estate to avoid inheritance tax. Now there, you get conflicted with the problem that you can't make gifts, but you want to do some tax planning. Well, there you need to approach the court and say, look, the individual never wanted to pay inheritance tax. They wanted to keep the value of their estate under the taxable limits. Here's the stuff they've done before. I want to carry that on. It's affordable. There's financial advisor saying this is okay. Then yes, the court will probably say it's okay. And I've done some cases in the past where we've done some fairly significant gifts. We had a lady who wanted, she had a property portfolio, was going to move into one of the rental properties, wanted to give away her main residence worth about £850,000 to her 2 children. Lost capacity before she could make the gift. We went to the court and said, look, here's the financial advisor's report. Here was the plan. Can we give away this property? And the court said yes, even though it was about half the value of her estate. They were satisfied she had enough money for the rest of her life. Her housing needs were met, and the children were in need of funds. It was mum's wish. Great, the court was on board with it. But it took a long time. It was about 1.5 years to get that application through. Attorneys have got to claim all the relevant benefits. If you miss out on claiming stuff as an attorney, again, you might be liable for loss to the individual's estate. If the individual's got debts, can they be called in? So you've got to be looking at bringing assets into the estate and not thinking about selling things to pay for care fees if there's outstanding loans that are repayable. The court will take a very, very dim view of attorneys or deputies who are seen to take advantage of vulnerable individuals. They said they'll remove them, they'll require them to repay funds, and potentially might be a referral to the police as well. There was some advice I was given by a senior partner many years ago, which was never, ever be an attorney or deputy. And I think with all those restrictions in place, it makes sense. But in practice, decisions do need to be taken for individuals, do need to be taken for children, particularly when they're over 18. Do it right is the key thing. And on that basis, some myth busting. These are things I've heard from clients previously. As a parent, I can take decisions for my child if they lack mental capacity. No, it depends on their age and understanding. If they're over 18, and you haven't got a health and welfare power of attorney or health deputyship, it's the doctors who are taking those decisions. As a parent, as a deputy, I can always take decisions for the individual. Well, as I've shown before, no, if they've got capacity to take the decisions themselves, then they can do it. Say, under 18, financial decisions are still in your hands. Health decisions very much depends on the individual themselves and their capacity, their ability to understand. Over 18, health and financial attorneyships. As attorney or deputy, I can do what I think is right with the individual's money. Well, what your perception of right might be very, very different to someone else's perception of right. There are restrictions on what attorneys and deputies can do. As I say, be really careful about making gifts, making interest-free loans. There are even situations where attorneys living in a parent's house rent-free could be a breach on the basis, that they are occupying that individual's house. They should be paying a rent. Now, it's kind of okay if they're providing care or something like that to the individual, but if they're just using it as a sort of DOS house, they should be paying a rent, and an attorney should be looking at charging that. As attorney or deputy, I can use individual money to support me. Yeah, we've covered that quite a lot. No, you can't, not unless you're authorised by the court to do so. And the absolute classic, it's what they would have wanted. Again, no, that is only a factor to take into account when you're doing that best interest, weighing up the pros and cons of the decision. So don't just rely on, they wanted me to have all this money. No. I was going to touch on will trusts. As I say, if you were at the presentation yesterday, you would have heard me go on at length about this. But will trusts are quite a useful tool to avoid the need for a financial deputyship or financial power of attorney. because the deputyship, the power of attorney, is only needed for the assets in the individual's name. So if they have their own bank account, you need someone to manage that. If they own their own house, you need someone to manage that. But if you leave your estate under your will into a trust, it's the trustees, your executors, who manage those assets, whether it's a property, bank account, so forth. They look after that for your child. The added advantage, other than not needing an attorney or deputy to manage that money, is that it's not taken into account in the individual's own finances, so should be exempt from financial assessments for care fees, things like that. Now, trustees of will trust can't take health decisions, but they can influence those decisions because they hold the money. And if there's a decision to move someone, local authority takes a decision to move someone to a particular care home, the trustees can step in and say, actually, we'd rather pay for a nicer care home and move them elsewhere. So say, do look at your will in conjunction with looking at powers of attorney as well. So just wanted to round off with a few minutes left for questions with some hints and tips. It's all about relationships, really, when you're trying to take decisions for a young or disabled child. If you can, get in there with social services, try and make a friend at social services. It's really tricky. I mean, there's a high turnover of staff, and some seem not to care, and they're hugely overwhelmed with their workloads. But if you can, try and get in with them, try and make a friend. It's much easier to have a nice conversation with someone and to get a result you want if you've established a good relationship with them. Make powers of attorney. I think if there's only one thing you do after this presentation, it's make a power of attorney. You never know when the bus is around the corner with your name on it. Heart attack, stroke, dementia, all these sorts of things can come on suddenly. And if you haven't got someone already appointed to take decisions for you, hopefully, as you've seen, it's complicated, it's messy, and it involves the court. Encourage family members to make powers of attorney as well. I've had so many clients who say, oh, I went through so much difficulty with mum and dad because we hadn't done it, wish we'd done it. These are all sort of phrases I hear. So yeah, take action early. You're never too young. Well, as long as you're over 18, you're never too young to make a power of attorney. And you can always remake it as the years go on. If you originally wanted to appoint children as attorney and they move overseas or relationships fade, then appoint someone else. Always think about other alternatives. So you can set up joint accounts. So the joint account owner can carry on making decisions. Some banks will freeze a joint account if one party's lost capacity. So just be aware of that. You could always put some money into someone else's name if you trust them to use that money for you, or think about having third-party signatories on accounts. That can really help if physically you're unable to access the account. You can have someone else signing on your behalf without the need for a power of attorney. Think about ways for assets not falling into children's hands. I've talked about the will trust, or maybe setting up a trust, lifetime trust for them to receive assets that can be used on their behalf. Plan ahead is probably the biggest. None of us like to think about the fact we may need care in the future. Fact is, we are all, as a society, living longer. Medical treatment is better, but we still get frail. And there may well come a time when you are unable to take decisions for yourself, or you're unable, not as physically able to take decisions. Think about care needs. Think about how they're going to be financed. I do have a lot of clients saying, I don't want the government to take my house to pay for care fees. Well, okay, there are steps you can do by structuring will trusts to protect some value. But then you're stuck in the social services care home. Is that really what you want? Maybe it's better to try and find a way to release funds to pay for your own care, so you get them on. And also watch a webinar on wills and trusts. There was quite a good one yesterday, I hear. So I know that's been recorded. Do have a look at it, because it does tie in, as I say, with what I've been talking about today. So that's everything I was going to say on mental capacity. Welcome to ask questions. I haven't seen anything pop up in the chat, but you're welcome to ask questions now. I know Kate's going to switch off the recording, but as I say, just a reminder, very happy for people to contact me with queries left, right, and centre. If it's not quite my bag, if it's more on the health side or it's about property ownership or something like that, there will be someone at Mitchell who can answer that. I can guarantee it. Thank you.